Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Kilfeather, and I'm the co-director of programming for March for Science NYC. It is my pleasure to welcome Naomi Oreskes to our virtual stage. Dr. Oreskes is a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of Earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. A world-renowned geologist, historian, and public speaker, she's a leading voice on the role of science and society and the reality of anthropogenic climate change. Okay. Hi, welcome.
Hi, good to be with you.
So in your book, Merchants of Doubt, you cover how public opinion on climate change was heavily influenced by just a handful of scientists with political connections, who are also themselves invested in maintaining market fundamentalism in the US. If you could, just for everyone who has not read this book, can you please just give like an overview of the content of it?
Wait, there are people who haven't read my book? Okay, right. So in Merchants of Doubt, Eric Conway and I were interested in answering the question, why would intelligent people doubt the reality of climate change? We've got 50 years of high-level science from people all around the world that have shown that the climate's changing. It's being driven by greenhouse gases and deforestation. And the answer we found was not what a lot of people would have suspected. It was not that they were shills for the fossil fuel industry. It was ideological. It was a right-wing or conservative or libertarian ideology that we think is best described as market fundamentalism. The belief that markets are the best way to solve our problems, that markets are more efficient than governance, and more importantly, or crucial to this way of thinking, that if you allow the government to become involved in the marketplace, that it threatens personal freedom and puts you on the slippery slope to socialism. And because they hold this ideological worldview, they filter the evidence through that framework, and they're resistant to the evidence of the reality of climate change because it threatens their worldview. And in the book, we showed how that same argument was used repeatedly across a set of issues, starting with the harms of tobacco, running through the harms of persistent pesticides, the harms of the chemicals that created the ozone hole, and all the way up through climate change. And now in the last couple of years, we've seen it with the COVID-19 case as well, people resisting the evidence of the need for mask mandates or the evidence for the need for vaccination mandates, arguing that it threatens our freedom.
So you talked about how that worldview helps skew public opinion away from the facts of climate change, but does that worldview also exacerbate the climate crisis? So,
well, it totally does. I mean, it totally exacerbates the climate crisis because it prevents action. And what we showed in the book is that these scientists who subscribe to market fundamentalism make common cause with regulated industries like the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry. And the message then is amplified through a network of right-wing and libertarian think tanks like the Cato Institute or the Competitive Enterprise Institute or the Heartland Institute, who send out this anti-government message because they don't want the government regulating the marketplace, because they don't want the government regulating the businesses that they're involved in. So it's a mechanism to protect industries like the tobacco industry or the fossil fuel industry that produce dangerous products that hurt people. But the way it works is to confuse you about the science. So instead of making an honest political argument about the proper role of government or the balance between personal liberty and the common good, which is a legitimate and longstanding intellectual question, it's kind of a classic question of political economy. Instead of having an honest debate about that, they muddy the waters, they poison the well of public debate by challenging the science. They say, oh, we don't really know, the science is unsettled, there's too many uncertainties, we're not really sure, because they know that if they can persuade people that the science is uncertain, then they can delay action. And we saw that in the case of tobacco. Scientists had demonstrated as early as the 1930s that smoking cigarettes caused cancer. It's not until the 1960s that we get the Surgeon General saying, yes, smoking is hazardous to your health. And it's not until the 2000s that Congress actually empowers the FDA to regulate nicotine as an addictive drug. And that giant delay is caused by the strategy of selling doubt.
That's really interesting. Sorry. So talking about this idea of market fundamentalism, but also kind of more broadly about capitalism and the reliance on sustained economic growth. How do you think, and you actually wrote about this a little bit in a piece I read recently, but how do you think economists are relying too heavily on that idea maybe, and potentially ignoring the realities of the climate crisis? I think you mentioned that stationarity no longer applies to climate effects. Can you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, so stationarity is the assumption that the present is a good indicator of the future, or that the future will be like the past. So we can use existing records on, say, floods to predict what the likelihood of a future flood will be. So let's say we're trying to estimate the likely cost of the 1 in 100-year flood, and we use it based on data from the past, let's say, 200 years. Well, that's all very well and good if the climate system isn't changing. But if the climate system is changing in a way that the 1 in 100-year flood now becomes the 1 in 10-year flood, or even 1 in 1-year flood, then the risk and the cost of that flood is much, much greater than it used to be. And so we have a lot of places where we've seen economists have underestimated the costs of climate change because they're trapped in this assumption of stationarity. We know the climate is changing in ways that are making hurricanes, floods, and other extreme weather events worse. And that means that the costs are escalating in ways that many climate models have not fully come to grips with. And so the net result of that is that we underestimate the true cost of climate change.
I mean, it's very dangerous and
extremely dangerous, because it means ordinary people don't have good information. And of course, this is one of the ironies about the market fundamentalist view. I mean, if you go back and read classic works in economics, if you read Adam Smith, which I've been doing lately, one of the key principles of a market economy is the idea that we have good information. If I decide to buy this water bottle or to sell it to you and I say, well, here's this nice water bottle, it's very pretty and it's cute and it keeps your water cold, and $10 is a fair price. Well, if you have good information about me or about my product, then you can judge whether $10 is a fair price. But if you don't have good information, if now the product is not a water bottle but a cigarette, and I'm lying to you about the harms of the cigarette, and I'm lying to you about the fact that my product is addictive, then you as a consumer are not able to make a good decision in the marketplace. And you're not able to figure out where your self-interest lies because you've been denied the information to enable you to make that choice. So even if you subscribe to a kind of classical economic worldview, what the merchants of doubt have done is to undermine our capacity to make good decisions in the marketplace.
I'm also curious because, especially with things like tobacco, and I guess living with the comforts of a capitalist system in America, I wonder if what you think about the ability to tug at the few nuggets of doubt the public has, and then that they are very easily swayed to then believe kind of the easier answer. Does that make any sense? So in terms of tobacco, like, no, it's fine for you, it's fine, you'll be fine. Yeah.
Well, part of the reason that doubtmongering works is because it's a good news message. So I'm a smoker, I like smoking, cigarettes are nice, they make me feel good. And some scientist come along and says, that cigarette you're smoking is going to kill you. And worse than that, it's not only going to kill you, it actually might kill your children through secondhand smoke, or it might give cancer to your flight attendant or your bartender. That's a pretty bad news story. And it's going to make me both feel bad about smoking myself. It might motivate me to quit, and it's going to make me feel really guilty. And if I'm a mother of young children, I might quit because maybe maybe I'm prepared to take the risk for myself, but I wouldn't want to hurt my own children. So doubtmongering works by giving you a good news story. But say, oh, don't worry, we don't really know, it's probably fine. Those scientists, they overreact to everything. And so both in tobacco and now with climate change, what we see is that the merchants of doubt sell a good news story. You don't really have to worry, climate change isn't that bad, we'll just adapt, technology will save us. So you can just go on living the way you're living. And obviously, if you have a choice between someone who says, oh, everything you're doing is fine, don't worry, or someone who says, no, this is really not fine, you actually have to worry a lot, and you might have to change the way you live, who's got the better message, right? There's a great cartoon I sometimes use in my talks, 2 movie theaters side by side. One is showing an inconvenient truth, the other is showing reassuring lies, and all the people are lined up to hear the reassuring lies.
Yeah, it's definitely the easier choice to make, to go be placated and told good things, when really the harder truth is what we're saying.
Right.
Absolutely.
And it also plays into what psychologists will call status quo bias. We know that status quo bias is very strong both for individuals and institutions. It's much easier to just continue business as usual than it is to change things. Change takes energy, change takes will, change takes thinking through, and change involves risk, right? There's no guarantee that if you change your system or your life, that you end up in a better place. So it's very easy for people to say, well, I'm not sure that those changes will really work, so I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. And so doubtmongering plays into status quo bias and says, it's all fine, just keep doing what you're doing.
But also change takes very often finances and money. So But as you're saying before, you think it's very, very much likely, if not definite, that economists are downplaying the cost of the climate crisis. So
underestimating, downplaying implies that it's deliberate. And I think for some groups and organizations it is, but I think for a lot of economists, it's not so much that it's deliberate as that there are assumed methodologies that kind of build in a bias towards what we were talking about before, towards stationarity. So I wouldn't say downplay, but I think we do have good evidence that for a variety of reasons, economists have underestimated the cost of climate change.
So what do you think, I mean, very easy question to ask, but what do you think is the solution? If how we're going and our current trajectory is not working, and it costs money to make a change, and we desperately need a change, what do you think is the way forward?
Obviously, that's a giant question. I mean, one thing I think, and all of my work has really been involved with this, is naming and shaming, right? If you expose the liars, the dishonesty, the untruths, the half-truths, if you expose them for what they are, that's already an important step, because no one wants to be conned. No one wants to be at the losing end of a con. Nobody wants to be a sucker. And in effect, what the fossil fuel industry has done is to make us all into suckers. We've been conned into thinking that this is all fine. And think about it, who pays the price? If we have a terrible hurricane that destroys homes and FEMA has to get called in and flood insurance claims get paid, who picks up the bill for that? It's not the fossil fuel industry, it's all of us. It's the American taxpayers. And if you go to the NOAA website, you can see we are looking at tens of billions of dollars every year now from extreme weather events, many of which, if not all, have been made worse by climate change. So we're talking about multi-billion-dollar bills that are being passed on to the American people every single year, while ExxonMobil and Chevron and Saudi Aramco and Total laugh all the way to the bank. So we've been on the losing end of a con game. And so a big part of my job is exposing that so that people get appropriately angry, like we should be angry, and then turn that anger into action.
I think it's incredibly important. And you actually have touched on it quite a bit in your work, I think, in terms of the responsibility of scientists to call out the liars and the people who are trying to con the public. And so I was wondering, and you also mentioned in your book, I believe, that the media is somewhat to blame in terms of like wanting to always take an unbiased, balanced approach when that's not always the truth. And so presenting both sides as having equal value. And so I'm wondering, how do we get the balance to tilt? And what role might scientists, especially climate scientists, have in making that happen?
Right. Well, again, I wouldn't use the language of balanced or unbalanced, or sorry, biased or unbiased, right? Because I'm not saying that the media should be biased in favor of climate change. I'm not saying that. One of the things we know, though, is that the media have been part of this problem. And to some extent, the media has been suckered as well. We showed in our book that it was a conscious and deliberate strategy of both the tobacco and the fossil fuel industry to exploit journalistic notions of objectivity that were tied up with the idea of balance, that objectivity, many journalists have traditionally felt, meant giving equal time to both sides of an argument. The problem with that is that both sides of an argument are not always both true. And if the argument is an opinion, like is chocolate better than vanilla, then sure, you could give equal time to the chocolate camp and the vanilla camp. But when the argument is climate change happening? Is it driven by fossil fuels? That's a factual question. It's a scientific question, and there's a scientific answer to that. And what the media has inadvertently done for a long time, and I think it's quite a bit better now. I think a lot of people in the media have kind of woken up to this, maybe hopefully in part because of our work. I think the media doesn't fall into that trap as much as they used to, but certainly for many, many years, we saw mainstream media presenting climate change as a big debate. Is it happening? Is it not happening? Long after the scientific evidence was clear that it was happening. And that we should have had a debate about policies, about responses, about actions, but that debate got deflected because the fossil fuel industry managed to keep us arguing about the science.
So now in terms of changes in policy and how to navigate and mitigate climate crisis, I'm curious just what your opinion is on what the role is, again, of scientists to do that. Part of what we try to do at March for Science is to engage more scientists to be more politically and socially active. And sometimes it's met with resistance because of they're very busy with their own work. They feel like that's their contribution to society is the science itself. But what do you think is the role of the scientist?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really hard question. And as you said, a lot of scientists just want to do science, and that's fine. You know, I mean, one problem we'll talk about the role of the scientist. Scientists are very diverse people, and I don't think that we can expect all scientists to play all roles at all times. That's not a realistic expectation. In my experience, most scientists just want to do science because that's what they were trained to do. That's what they know how to do. That's what they're comfortable doing. And it's their job. That's what they get paid to do. And so it's totally reasonable for a scientist to say, I want to do my science. That's my job. That's what I'm here for. And I have total sympathy for that. And I would never criticize any scientist who says, what I really want to do is do my job, right? But, and here's the but, the problem, I think, is that the scientific community has been operating under what I call the supply side model of science. And by that, I mean that scientists have thought that their job is to supply the science. So we do the scientific work, and then we hand it over to the policymakers, assuming that the policymakers will use it. Well, that model has not worked. And that's a fact, right? I mean, the evidence of the failure of the supply side model is everywhere. And one of the reasons is it hasn't worked, and I'm not saying this is the only thing, because it's obviously a very complicated landscape, but one of the reasons it hasn't worked is because of the active resistance of groups like climate change deniers, the active resistance of the fossil fuel industry, who have deliberately tried to muddy the waters, deliberately tried to undermine public understanding of science, deliberately poison the well of public debate. And so the model that we just do our science and hand it over doesn't work in the face of a reality of political and cultural opposition. And so someone has got to face up to and address that opposition. Now, in many cases, chemists, physicists, evolutionary biologists are not really equipped to do that work. So my argument is not so much that evolutionary biologists need to become political activists, but that they should be mindful of the fact that these things are happening and think through, what are your strategies for dealing with that if you encounter it in your own work? Because the mistake that a lot of scientists have made in the past is to think that this was a scientific debate and that therefore it could be answered with more scientific evidence. We know that that's not true. And so my argument is that now that you know that, you have to rethink some of your strategies. And so one thing you might do, let's say if you're a climate science, if you're in some kind of situation where somebody raises a doubt-mongering issue, instead of trying to answer the science, what you do is to say, that's doubt-mongering, and I'm going to move on, right? Don't legitimize it by getting engaged with it. And this is a mistake that many scientists have made. They get involved in the argument on Twitter or Facebook, whatever, and the next thing you know, they're in a debate, which proves the point of the deniers, right? They want us to think it's a great big scientific debate. So if you debate, they've won. You've now confirmed their framework. So you have to be aware of it in order to get out of that framework and say, no, I'm not going to debate the scientific facts. If you'd like to have a debate about policy strategies, if you'd like to have a debate about what the right number is for putting a price on carbon, that's a debate I welcome, because that's a policy question that needs to be debated, but I'm not going to debate the science.
I love that, kind of reclaiming a little bit more of like, I'm the expert in the situation. So, I mean, I can just tell you what I know, and then we can discuss ways to move forward. So I think it's.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing, of course, is to point out that just because you are a scientist doesn't mean you give up your citizenship rights at the laboratory door. So as a person who's well-informed on an issue, you can be engaged and you can play a positive role in public debate by stepping forward and saying, I am a scientist and I support, a carbon tax for the following reasons, or whatever it is. So I do think that scientists can do more of that. And I think one thing that holds scientists back is what I think is a mistaken notion of objectivity. A lot of scientists think that being objective means being neutral, that you don't take a position. And that's not what objectivity is. Objectivity means that in your work, you try as much as possible to look at the data honestly and to let the chips fall where they fall. And you do work, and maybe the results are not what you expected. Maybe you had a theory or a hypothesis and your data actually doesn't support it. So then you embrace that and you revise your thinking in light of evidence. That's what objectivity, scientific objectivity is. It doesn't mean that you don't have a position, on whether we should allow non-reusable plastic bags, right?
It's the beauty of science and the strength of science is exactly what you're saying. So.
Exactly.
Before we end, is there anything else that you'd like to say on this broadcast for Stage 2022?
So people should read our new book. So Eric Conway and I have a new book that'll be coming out early next year. It's called The Big Myth: How American Business taught us to love how American business taught us to loathe the government and love the free market. And it's all about how the ideology of market fundamentalism was really built up and developed as a kind of cultural framework over a really long period of time. So it looks into this question, why do so many people buy into the idea that markets can solve our problems, and particularly why it could solve the climate problem, when we have so much evidence to show that that's not true? I mean, markets are really good at delivering goods, like a nice water bottle. They're really bad at dealing with collective action problems. And we've known this for a long time. The evidence of this is enormous. And yet somehow so many people keep coming back to the idea that somehow markets will solve the climate problem, but climate change is a market failure. And we need to embrace that and acknowledge it in order to figure out, well, if it is a market failure, then how do we fix the market failure? And so the book looks at why has that been such a hard thing for people to address? And part of the reason is because we've been subject to 100 years of myth building around the magic of the marketplace.
Well, I will be absolutely reading that when it comes out. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Bye.